Movies intended to shock or frighten their audiences have existed since the early days of cinema, although it took several decades for horror to emerge as its own distinct genre. See, the term horror was a bit taboo in the early days of cinema thanks to early Hollywood censorship campaigns, which, in case you didn't know, early Hollywood was a little bit wild with the kind of content that it would show. And it wasn't until the Hays Code in the 1930s that Hollywood would start to rein itself in. Looking back with a modern lens, though, we can start to see great works of horror as early as the 1920s. But it wasn't until the end of the Hays Code in the late 60s that the horror genre really began to bloom. In the silent era, horror didn't exist yet. What we would consider horror was grouped in with mysteries thanks to its association with the strange, eerie, and mysterious. In the modern context of horror, the German expressionist film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is considered to be the first great work of the genre. In the film, Dr. Caligari hypnotizes his assistant and uses him to commit a series of grisly murders without his knowledge. The film used a surrealistic production design, making use of deep shadows to create an eerie and nightmarish tone. At the time of the film's release, Germany was still recovering from the loss of World War I, and the people of Germany were a lot more suspicious of authority. The way the film depicts an authority figure using a subordinate to commit his own grisly crimes was reflective of the German sentiment at the time. The film would become a model for later German expressionist films and would also be influential on post-World War II film noir in America. As the title implies, the Golden Age of Hollywood was a pretty big deal in cinema history, but it was subverted by the inception of the Hays Code. If any of you are familiar with how the video game rating system came about, the Hays Code came about in much the same way. Religious leaders had become critical of the immoral content shown in films, and Hollywood sought to censor itself. The Hays Code had forced filmmakers to be a little more creative in the way that they depicted violent or immoral content, and this led to a more understated tone of horror. In 1930, Universal's adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula would kick off a 3-decade fascination with monster movies. While films of this type began to pick up speed in the 30s, it wasn't until the 50s that America's fascination with monster movies would explode via TV syndication. Most of these films were Universal productions, though it was actually thanks to Columbia's Screen Gems that these movies became available on television. The accessibility that television brought into the home allowed youth to be exposed and fascinated by these fantastical creatures. In these movies, younger groups were seeing concepts that they had become familiar with, whether it be through the news or through overhearing their parents' conversations. The 40s and 50s were permeated by fears of strange new threats, fear of the atomic bomb, of the effects of nuclear radiation, and the fear of action by Soviet forces. These fears were reflected in the monster movies as an irradiated lizard terrorized Japan in Godzilla, or as alien forces indoctrinated Americans in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You have to remember that at the end of the day, film production is a business, and upon seeing the resonance that these types of films had with the youth, production companies began to shift their focus to a younger audience. Television screens became awash with low quality and low budget monster films, and while that's not to say that the two were mutually inclusive, this created a somewhat accidental overlap between horror and comedy, thanks to these poorly made films with laughable special effects. Consider the film I Was a Teenage Werewolf. The title really tells you all you need to know. This then triggered a more purposeful overlap of the two genres, leading to cult classics like Little Shop of Horrors. During the same period that youth were filled with monster media, another notable filmmaker was making his mark on cinema history. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, was exploiting film technology to its highest potential. Using VistaVision widescreen to capture enormous sets and Technicolor to bring vibrancy to the screen, Hitchcock even concluded one of his most famous films, North by Northwest, atop Mount Rushmore. Hitchcock movies were largely considered thrillers, but his most iconic film, Psycho, is now considered the horror classic. In fact, I believe that it triggered the rise of psychological horror in the 60s with films such as Rosemary's Baby and the genre-redefining film Night of the Living Dead. Speaking of Night of the Living Dead, while I'm sure many of you have heard of it, If you weren't alive or old enough to be aware of the broader world at the time of the film's release, then you likely don't realize just how vital this film is to cinema history. Just as Romero had wrapped Night of the Living Dead and was preparing it for distribution in 1968, on the radio he heard the news of Martin Luther King's assassination. The filmmakers immediately feared that this would interrupt the distribution of the film, due to the perceived implications of the black hero, Ben, being killed by a white posse mistaking him for a zombie in the final moments of the film. While the filmmakers had no political agenda while creating the film, the socio-political climate of the time did influence the film's interpretation and led to the rise of movies which depicted people rather than otherworldly creatures as the monsters. These movies also didn't shy away from graphic on-screen violence, which is now possible with the revision of the Hays Code. Over the course of the Night of the Living Dead, all the protagonists are killed. There is no deus ex machina and no happy ending, which is something that big Hollywood producers would never have dreamed of. Movies like Night of the Living Dead, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Last House on the Left demonstrated the potential of independent filmmakers in the 70s. These films disrupted the status quo of the industry, which was reflective of the disruption of normalcy in America at the time due to Vietnam, Watergate, and the civil rights movement. In these films, the protagonists are driven to brutality by forces beyond their control. And the heroes aren't really heroes. They're flawed. They're just people. And this idea of people against people became pretty pervasive. And Wes Craven, who was a developing filmmaker at the time, claims to have been inspired by newsreel footage of the war in Vietnam to adopt a cinema verite approach to on-screen violence. Squibs, which are balloons filled with fake blood, were used to mimic blood loss from injury, and multi-camera setups with cameras running at different speeds, combined with montage editing, emphasized the brutality of on-screen violence, which directors argued was a comment on the social violence of the time. Supernatural horror began to emerge as a subgenre in the 70s, and its popularity would continue into the 80s, kicking off the decade with Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Just as syndication had revived monster films in the 50s, the airing of a censored version of The Exorcist began to fuel a dangerous feedback loop. With ghosts and demons in the mind of youth, parents began to become increasingly paranoid about satanic and occult influences. The popularity of slasher films, born out of the normalization of graphic violence in the 70s, helped to worsen parents' fear of how this content was affecting their children. From this came the satanic panic, a social paranoia that gripped the 80s. And just as with previous eras, horror adapted to the fears of the public, which further fueled the fire. It wasn't until supernatural horror began to degrade in quality and became parodied in the early 90s that the satanic panic would begin to die off. The end of the satanic panic almost spelled the death of the horror genre, and horror movies started to degrade in popularity and quality for a while. Nonetheless, the emergence of horror satire franchises like Scream and Scary Movie helped to sustain the genre through the 90s. The movies mocked the horror tropes of the previous two eras, with characters who were self-aware of the horror movie plot and women who accepted their roles as the victims of the genre. These films served to demonstrate that the genre to this point had been somewhat exhausted and was due for some change. The lack of innovation in the genre led producers to look elsewhere for source material. While continuing to follow the line of supernatural horror, American filmmakers began to draw inspiration from Korean and Japanese horror films. Sadako from The Ring and The Curse-Born Spirit of the Grudge haunted the zeitgeist of the 2000s and 2010s. The rapid development and fixation on technology also bled into horror films, with the J-horror ghost coming through tapes and TV screens, or foretelling death through cell phone calls. The Paranormal Activity franchise saw success by using a found footage style to capitalize on the increased number of cameras that Americans now had in their homes. Despite the lack of innovation in the genre, horror continued to reflect cultural fears. Following 9/11, thoughts of torture and imprisonment were heavy on the minds of many Americans, and this allowed Hostel and Saw to be met with great reception, which, as you know, Saw is now in its 11th incarnation. Lately, we've seen an increased prevalence of social media in horror, with franchises like Unfriended taking place entirely through the lens of a video call among friends, which, by the way, if you want to see this actually done well, you should check out the movie Host. We're seeing a lot of internet concepts like the dark web being incorporated into these films as well. Since the election of 2016, increased discourse on the latent racism in American society, and social movements like Me Too, in addition to an increased awareness of mental health, I believe that the horror genre is about to experience another boom. Filmmakers like Jordan Peele, who made the unexpected leap from comedy to horror movies, uses themes of racial prejudice and exploitation to fuel the horror in his films. Ari Aster uses surrealism and cult practices, as well as incorporating generational trauma and mental health. In the past few years, we've seen the beginning of a revolution in the genre, which I predict will continue through the coming decade. Horror has been a huge part of our culture for the past 100 years, holding a mirror to us so that we might not only face our fears, but our failings as a society. It serves to critique our morals, our beliefs, and our actions, and to pose an answer to the question, what's the worst that could happen? Hopefully you've enjoyed this little journey through the development of horror as much as I did researching it. Feel free to share with your horror-loving friends, and don't forget to lock your doors. Sweet dreams.